Hello, and this is my audio recording of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. All right, guys, so you know that I butcher names, so just a warning. I kind of butcher a lot of the names in here, and it's not going to be the most perfect audio recording, but for those of you who like to listen to things read to you, hopefully this will help you out. But just kind of a warning, I do tend to kind of butcher names. Okay, so your reading homework, 7th block, starts on page 16, so we'll just start there. Page 16. In the middle of the mess hall, there were 2 rows of what you might call pillars or supports. Fetikov, another fellow from the same gang, was sitting by one of them and guarding Shukov's breakfast. He didn't count for much in the gang, even less than Shukov. To look at them, the gang was all the same black overcoats and numbers, but underneath, they were all different. You couldn't ask the captain to guard your bowl, and there were jobs even Shukov wouldn't do, jobs that were beneath him. Fetikov spotted Shukov and gave up his seat with a sigh. "It's all over now. I was going to eat it for you. I thought you were in the cooler." He didn't wait around. He knew that Shukov wouldn't leave him any. He'd polished off both bowls himself. Shukov pulled a spoon out of his boot. He was very fond of the spoon which had gone with him all over the north. He'd made it himself from aluminum wire and cast it in the sand, and he had scratched on it, Us Ishma, 1944. Then Shukov took his cap off his shaved head. However cold it was, he would never eat with it on. He stirred up the cold gruel and took a quick look to see what was in the bowl. It was the usual thing. It hadn't been ladled from the bottom of the cauldron, but it wasn't the stuff from the bottom either. He wouldn't put it past Fetikov to pinch a potato from it. The only good thing about camp gruel was that it was usually hot, but what Shukov had was now quite cold. Even so, he ate it slow and careful like he always did. Mustn't hurry now, even if the roof caught fire. Apart from sleeping, the prisoners' time was their own for only 10 minutes at breakfast, 5 minutes at the noon break, and another 5 minutes at supper. The gruel didn't change from one day to the next. It depended on what vegetables they stored for the winter. The year before, they'd only stocked up with salted carrots, so there was nothing but carrots in the gruel from September to June. And now it was cabbage. The camp was fed best in June when they ran out of vegetables and started using groats instead. The worst time was July when they put shredded nettles in the cauldron. The fish was mostly bones. The flesh was boiled off except for bits on the tails and the heads, not leaving a single scale or speck of flesh on the skeleton. Shukov crunched and sucked the bones and spit them out on the table. He didn't leave anything, not even the gills or the tail. He ate the eyes, too, when they were in place, but when they'd come off and were floating around in the bowl on their own, he didn't eat them. The others laughed at him for this. Okay, that's a really gross scene. I hate fish. All right, but that's not the point. Oh, by the way, this is now, you should probably now do your sticky notes on me for those 2 pages. So go ahead and do that. Make sure it's in the book. Don't put it on a sheet of paper, please. Okay, page 18. Shukov made a kind of saving today. He hadn't been back to his barracks to collect his bread ration, and now he was eating without it. Bread? Well, you could always eat that by itself, and he'd feel less hungry later on. The second course was a mush out of magara. It was one solid lump, and Shukov broke it off in pieces. When it was hot, never mind when it was cold, it had no taste and didn't fill you. It was nothing but grass that looked like Malay. They'd gotten the bright idea of serving it instead of groats. It came from the Chinese, they said. They got 10 ounces of it, and that was that. It wasn't the real thing, but it passed for mush. He licked his spoon, pushed it back in his boot, put on his cap, and went to the hospital block. The sky was as dark as ever, and the stars were blotted out by the camp lights, and the 2 searchlights were cutting broad swaths through the compound. At the same time they set up the camp. It was a special one. The guards still had a lot of flares. If the electricity failed, they'd send a shower of rockets over the compound, white, green, and red, just like at the front. Then they stopped using them. Maybe they thought it was too expensive. It was just as dark as it was at the Reveille. But from this and that, and the other, an old hand could see that roll call would soon be sounded. Clubfoot's assistant, Clubfoot was a mess hall orderly, so an orderly person kind of in charge, who had kept an assistant out of his own pocket, had gone to summon Barrack 6 to breakfast. Number 6 was for invalids, men who couldn't work off the compound. Excuse me. An old artist with a little beard trotted over to the culture and education section to get paint and a brush to paint number tags for prison uniforms. Once more, the Tartar dashed across the yard toward HQ. There weren't many people around. They'd all gone undercover and were warming themselves these last sweet minutes. Shukov ducked behind the corner of a hut to get out of Tartar's way. If he caught him a second time, he'd screw him good. Anyway, you had to keep your eyes open all the time. You had to be careful the warders didn't see you alone, but only in a crowd. They were always on the lookout for someone to do or a job to have someone to pick on if they were in a lousy mood. They put out a standing order in the camp that you had to take your cap off at a distance of 5 paces when you saw a warder and keep it off till you're 2 paces past him. Some of the warders wandered around with their eyes shut and just didn't care, but others got a kick out of it. The number of guys had been put in the can just on this. No, thank you. Better to wait around the corner. The Tartar went by, and Shukov was just about to go to the hospital when he suddenly remembered that the Latvian in Barrack 7 had told him to come this morning before roll call to buy a couple of mugs of tobacco. But Shukov was so busy he had gone clean out of his head. The big Latvian had gotten a package from home the evening before, and maybe by tomorrow there wouldn't be any left. It might be a month there before there would be another package, and his tobacco was good. It had the right strength and it smelled good and was sort of brownish. Shukov felt bothered and stopped dead. Should he look in at number 7? But he was near the hospital, so he went up onto the steps. The snow crunched under his feet. The corridor in the hospital was so clean, it always was, and he was scared to walk along it. The walls were painted a shiny white, and the furniture was all white as well. But the office doors were shut. The doctors must still be in bed. One of the medics, a young fellow by the name of Nikolai Vodushkin, was sitting in the orderly's room at a nice clean desk, and he was wearing a nice clean white coat. He was writing something. There was no one else around. Shukov took off his hat as though this were one of the higher-ups, and in the good old-fashioned looking at things you weren't supposed to see, he couldn't help noticing that Vodushkin was writing in neat straight lines, starting each line right under the one with a capital letter and leaving a little room at the side. Shukov saw at once, of course, that this wasn't work, but some stuff his own and none of Shukov's business. Listen, Nikolai Semenovich, I'm feeling kind of sick. Okay, so just FYI, Russians often go by multiple names. So Nikolai, whatever his last name is, the same as Vodushkin, and he's just the guy at the hospital. So just FYI, Shukov is trying to get the day off of work because he's not feeling well. So let's see what happens. Vodushkin looked up from his work, cool and wide-eyed. He wore a white cap to match his coat, and he had no number tags. But why did you wait till now? And why didn't you come yesterday evening? You know we can't take people in the morning. We've already sent the sick list to the PPS. Shukov knew all of this, and it wasn't any easier to get on the sick list in the evening either. But the trouble is, Nikolai, it doesn't feel so bad in the evening when it ought to. What's wrong with you? Well, when you get down to it, it's nothing in particular. I just feel rotten all over. Shukov was not one of those who was always hanging around the hospital block, and Vodushkin knew it. But he was allowed to excuse only 2 men in the morning, and he had already excused them, and their names were on the list under the greenish glass on the table. There was a line drawn under them. Okay, I'm going to try. Guys, go ahead and you can do your sticky note summary for page 21 now. You can do your sticky note summary for those 2 pages. Okay, page 22. You should have thought of this before. What do you think you're doing here, coming here just before roll call? Here. Vodushkin took one of the thermometers, sticking through a gauze in a jar, wiped the solution off of it, and gave it to Shukov. Shukov sat down on a bench by the wall, keeping on the very edge of it, but just far enough in not to tip it over. He didn't choose this awkward place on purpose, but this was how he showed he was out of his depth in the hospital block and didn't expect very much. Vodushkin went on writing. The hospital block was in the most out-of-the-way corner of the compound, and there was no noise from outside. There were no clocks ticking here. The prisoners weren't supposed to have any. The powers that be kept time for them. You'd even hear a mouse scratching. They'd all been caught by the hospital cat appointed for the purpose. Shukov felt odd sitting by a bright lamp in such a clean room when it was so quiet and doing nothing for 5 whole minutes. He studied all the walls, but there was nothing. He looked at his jacket. The number on his chest had gotten a little worn. He'd have to have it redone if he didn't want trouble. He felt his beard. It had gotten pretty rough since that last visit to the bathhouse about 10 days ago. But what the hell? There'd be another bath in about 3 days, and he'd have a shave then. Why waste time waiting in line at the barber's? He didn't have to look his best for anyone. Then, looking at Vodushkin's nice white cap, Shukov remembered the field hospital on the river Lovat, where he had gone there with an injured jaw and, dope that he was, returned to his unit of his own free will. And he could have had 5 whole days in bed. So again, right, like Shukov, he's kind of regretting the fact that there was a while back, he really could have had more days off, but he didn't take advantage of it. Now he's sick, and now it doesn't seem like they're giving him the day off. All right, let's keep going. Now, his one dream was to get sick for a couple of weeks, not fatally or anything that needed an operation, but just sick enough to be sent to the hospital. He'd lie there, he thought, for 3 weeks without moving, and even if the soup they gave you was a little thin, it would still be great. But then Shukov remembered that there was no peace, even in the hospital nowadays. There was a new doctor who'd come with a recent batch of prisoners, Stefan Grigorievich, a loud-mouthed know-it-all who never stayed still himself and never let the patients alone either. He had the bright idea of putting all the walking cases to work around the hospital, making fences and paths, carrying earth to the flower beds. And in the winter, there was always snow to clear. He kept saying that work was the best cure for illness. What he didn't understand was that work has killed many a horse. So maybe do your sticky note summary for page 22 and 23. I'm going to do that now. Just a quick summary. Page 24. If he'd put in a little hard work laying bricks, he wouldn't go around shooting off his mouth so much. Vodushkin was still writing away. He really was doing something on the side, something that didn't mean much to Zhukov. He was copying out a long poem that he'd given the finishing touches to the day before, and had promised to show Stepan Grigorovich today, the man who believed in work as a cure-all. This sort of thing could only happen in a camp. It was Stepan Grigorovich who told Vodushkin to say he was a medic and then gave him the job. So Vodushkin started learning how to give injections to poor, ignorant prisoners who would never let it enter their simple, trusting minds that a medic might not be a medic at all. Okay, did you pick up on that? So Vodushkin really doesn't know what he's doing. He's just kind of picked it up on the spot. So he's not really like a real medical professional. So Nikolay, again, that's the same person as Vodushkin. Nikolay had studied literature at the university and had been arrested in his second year. Stepan Grigorovich wanted him to write the sort of thing here he couldn't write outside. The signal for roll call came faintly through the double windows. They were covered by ice. Zhukov sighed and stood up. He still felt feverish, but it looked as though he had no chance to get out of work. Vodushkin reached for his thermometer and squinted at it. Look, it's hard to say. Just under 99. If it were over 100, it'd be a clear case, but as things are, I can't let you off. Take a chance and stay if you want. If the doctor takes a look at you and thinks you're sick, he'll let you off. But if not, it's the cooler for you. You'd be better off going to work. Zhukov said nothing. He didn't even nod. He rammed on his cap and went out. When you're cold, don't expect sympathy from someone who's warm. The air outside hit Zhukov. The cold and the biting mist took a hold of him and made him cough. It was 16 degrees below while his own temperature was 99 above. He had to fight it out. Zhukov trotted off to the barracks. The yard was absolutely empty. There wasn't a soul to be seen. It was that short, blissful moment when there was no way out anymore, but people kidded themselves that there was, and there wouldn't be a roll call. The escort guards were sitting in their warm barracks, leaning their heads against their rifles. It was no picnic for them either, to kick their heels on top of watchtowers in this freezing cold. The guards in the main guardhouse threw some more coal in the stove. The warders in the warders' room were finishing their last cigarette before going out to search the prisoners. The prisoners, they were now dressed in all their rags, tied around with all their bits of string, and their faces wrapped in rags from chin to eyes to protect them from the cold, were lying on their bunks. All right, guys, go and do your sticky note summary for pages 24 and 25. This is also the end of this first part of the audio recording. I'm going to record the rest of it in like 2 other segments. So, if you want to keep reading with me, then feel free to YouTube the next 2 other segments that I've recorded. God bless you and have a good day.